The vast, white expanse of Greenland stretched endlessly under a sky often muted, sometimes brilliantly clear, but always cold. Beneath this ancient, unforgiving landscape, a new world was taking shape in 1959. It was a testament to human ambition, a vision of permanence in a transient domain. Camp Century, a network of tunnels and chambers carved directly into the ice sheet, promised a self-sufficient Arctic city. It was a marvel powered by a compact nuclear reactor designed to house hundreds of men, sustain research, and, in whispers that grew louder with each passing year, to explore radical strategic possibilities. The official narrative spoke of scientific inquiry, of understanding the Arctic's secrets. Yet for those within its icy walls, the true purpose, a concept of a mobile missile launch site, lent a profound gravity to their daily existence. The initial exhilaration of carving this subterranean world soon gave way to a starker reality. The ice, a seemingly solid foundation, was in fact a slow-moving river, an immense geological force, patient and relentless. The tunnels, meticulously engineered and painstakingly constructed, began to deform. What started as subtle shifts in the frozen walls quickly escalated into visible buckling. Roofs, once perfectly arched, sagged ominously. The structural integrity, the very promise of permanence, was being challenged by the environment it sought to conquer. Each groan and creak of the ice became a constant, unsettling reminder of the precarious balance. Life inside Camp Century became a cycle of construction and deconstruction, a desperate struggle against an invisible, all-encompassing pressure. The men lived with the omnipresent threat of collapse. Equipment was damaged, vital supply lines threatened, and the ever-present danger chipped away at morale. The dream of a stable, strategic outpost was slowly being crushed by the very medium that sustained it. Fear, a quiet companion, settled into the cramped quarters and long corridors. Among the hundreds of faces, one figure moved with a particular blend of urgency and quiet observation: Sergeant Elias Vance. He was not an officer nor a celebrated engineer, but a non-commissioned officer responsible for overseeing the maintenance of the base's critical infrastructure. His days were a ceaseless patrol, inspecting stress fractures, supervising makeshift repairs, and witnessing firsthand the relentless, slow-motion destruction. He saw the despair in the eyes of the younger recruits, the weary resignation of the veterans. He felt the cold seeping into his bones and the frustration burning in his gut. Elias was a man of the earth, or rather, of the ice. He understood practicalities, the language of materials and forces. He possessed an innate empathy for the men under his command and a deep-seated revulsion for inefficiency, especially when it jeopardized lives. He watched as engineers, brilliant in their theoretical understanding, struggled to apply their knowledge to this unprecedented, dynamic environment. Orders came down from higher echelons, often requiring massive resource expenditure for what Elias instinctively knew were temporary fixes. He saw the disconnect between the drawing board and the grinding reality of the ice. His own hands had touched the cold, sweating steel of collapsing supports had felt the vibrations of the ice's inexorable movement. He knew the urgency was not being met with effective, lasting solutions. The official channels, he observed, were slow, cautious, and often paralyzed by their own established protocols. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Elias. He couldn't stand by while the base, and the men within it, slowly succumbed. The sheer waste of human effort, the immense resources poured into this monumental undertaking, only to be undone by the very ground it stood upon, gnawed at him. He believed there had to be a better way, a different approach than simply trying to hold back an ocean of ice with conventional methods. His mind, restless and observant, began to work on its own, outside the rigid structure of command. During his brief off hours, while others sought solace in cards or sleep, Elias would walk the most precarious sections of the tunnels. He wasn't just inspecting, he was listening. He'd press his ear against the ice, trying to discern the subtle groans, the deeper rumbles that signaled the ice's shifting moods. He carried a small notebook, filled with rough sketches, measurements taken with a tape he carried in his pocket, and observations no one else seemed to record. He noted where the pressure points were most acute, how the ice reacted to temperature fluctuations, how it seemed to flow around certain obstacles. He was trying to understand the ice not as a static problem, but as a dynamic entity. His initial ideas were crude, almost outlandish, certainly outside the accepted engineering doctrines of the time. He thought about the natural world, how rivers flowed, how mountains endured. He began to envision solutions that didn't fight the ice directly, but rather worked with its inherent properties, perhaps redirecting its immense force or creating flexible zones that could absorb its pressure. He considered the properties of different materials, their elasticity, their thermal conductivity. He even started to experiment with small pieces of scrap metal and plastic, trying to replicate the ice's pressure on miniature scale. He tentatively raised some of his observations during a routine briefing, suggesting that the current reinforcement methods might be exacerbating certain stress points. He was met with polite but firm dismissal. "Sergeant Vance, we appreciate your diligence, but these are complex engineering problems handled by specialists with years of advanced training," a senior officer stated, his tone implying that Elias was overstepping. An engineer, a man with multiple degrees, offered a patronizing smile. "The models are clear, Sergeant. We adhere to established principles." The message was unambiguous. Stick to your duties. Elias understood. His ideas, born of practical experience and raw observation, were not welcome in the halls of theoretical expertise. This initial rejection, however, did not deter him. It only solidified his resolve to pursue his own path. The lives of his comrades, the integrity of the base, felt too important to leave solely in the hands of those who couldn't see the ice for what it truly was. He started working in earnest, in the deepest, least used sections of the base, often by the dim glow of a portable lamp. He scavenged for materials, discarded steel beams, lengths of heavy-duty canvas, even old heating coils. He began to apply his rough sketches to the physical world, trying to create small-scale prototypes of his flexible support structures or pressure redistributing mechanisms. The challenges were enormous. Resources were scarce, time was limited, and the constant threat of discovery loomed. He knew that if his unsanctioned experiments were found out, he could face severe disciplinary action. Yet, the image of a collapsing tunnel, the memory of a close call with falling ice, fueled his clandestine efforts. His first attempts were often failures. A makeshift brace buckled, a pressure sensor he fashioned from spare parts gave inaccurate readings. A small section of ice he tried to manipulate refused to cooperate. Each failure was a lesson, a refinement. He learned through trial and error, his hands becoming his most trusted instruments. He was alone in this endeavor, a single figure against the immense, indifferent force of the ice, and the equally immense, often indifferent force of the military bureaucracy. But in the quiet hum of the base and the creaking symphony of the ice, Elias Vance found a nascent hope, a flicker of possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, he could make a difference. His ingenuity, born of necessity and deep conviction, was slowly taking shape in the heart of the frozen continent. The relentless cold became a permanent resident in Elias's bones, but a different kind of fire burned within him. He spent every spare moment in the abandoned sections of the base, the ice groaning its slow, mournful song around him. His portable lamp cast dancing shadows, illuminating the stark reality of his workspace. A small, forgotten cavity, far from the main arteries of Camp Century. Here, amidst discarded equipment and the pervasive chill, he labored. He was experimenting with a concept he termed adaptive resilience. Instead of rigidly opposing the ice's immense force, he sought to create structures that would yield, absorb, and redistribute its pressure. His inspiration came from watching how flexible materials deformed under stress, how a tree bent in the wind rather than breaking. He envisioned a system that would allow the ice to flow around or past critical areas rather than directly against them. His first sketches, crude and hurried, began to take on a more defined form. He focused on a segmented panel design, a series of interlocking flexible plates that could be installed along the tunnel walls. These plates, he theorized, would not be fixed rigidly to the ice, but rather would float within a carefully constructed cavity, absorbing the lateral pressure and allowing the ice to slowly creep past without directly crushing the vital infrastructure. The challenge was finding materials that were both strong enough to withstand the pressure and flexible enough to deform without failing. Scavenging became a daily ritual. He haunted the disposal areas, the workshops, the forgotten corners of the base. Discarded conveyor belt sections, made of heavy-duty reinforced rubber, became his primary material. He found lengths of flexible steel cable once used for heavy lifting, and even old, flattened fuel drums whose metal could be reshaped. Each piece was a treasure, a fragment of possibility. He worked with rudimentary tools, a hacksaw, a hammer, a heavy-duty drill he'd borrowed from a supply depot, knowing he'd return it before anyone noticed its absence. His early prototypes were clumsy failures. A section of rubber he installed buckled inward, unable to cope with the sustained pressure. A steel plate he tried to curve snapped under the strain. The ice, an unforgiving teacher, exposed every flaw in his design, every miscalculation. He learned about the sheer, unyielding power of the glacial mass, the subtle ways it exerted its will. He realized the flexibility needed to be carefully calibrated, not just a simple give, but a controlled deflection. The base's condition, meanwhile, continued its slow, alarming decline. A critical storage tunnel, vital for housing winter supplies, suffered a significant collapse. No one was seriously injured, but the incident highlighted the escalating danger. The official response was to reinforce the remaining tunnels with heavier, more rigid steel supports, a method Elias viewed with growing despair. He saw the new supports as merely providing more rigid points for the ice to push against, potentially transferring the stress to other, weaker areas. The engineers, following established doctrine, saw it as the only viable solution. Elias witnessed the strain on the men, the constant threat of collapse, the unending repairs, the gnawing uncertainty. Morale was visibly affected. He heard the hushed conversations, the expressions of fear and frustration. This reaffirmed his conviction. He couldn't stop. He refined his design. He envisioned a modular system where each flexible panel would be connected to its neighbors, distributing the load across a wider area. He began to focus on the interface between the panel and the ice, realizing it needed to be smooth, almost frictionless, to encourage the ice to slide past. He experimented with a thick, waxy lubricant he'd found in a forgotten storage locker intended for heavy machinery. Applied to the back of his rubber panels, it created a surprisingly effective, low-friction surface. His progress was slow, agonizingly so. The cold stiffened his fingers. The dim light strained his eyes. He worked in isolation. The only sounds, the creaking of the ice, the distant hum of the reactor, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer. He started to understand the ice not as an enemy, but as a force to be respected and understood. He began to speak its language, anticipating its movements, finding its subtle weaknesses. One evening, after weeks of relentless effort, he finally completed a small, 2-meter section of his adaptive panel system in his hidden test cavity. It was crude, held together with scavenged bolts and reinforced rubber. He had carefully carved out a space in the tunnel wall, creating a shallow recess where the panel could float. He lubricated the back of the rubber, then gently nudged a heavy, custom-cut ice block against it, replicating the lateral pressure. He watched, breath held, as the ice block slowly, inexorably, began to press against the panel. Instead of buckling or cracking, the rubber section gently deformed, absorbing the pressure, and then, almost imperceptibly, the ice block began to slide along the lubricated surface, past the panel's edge. It wasn't a perfect, fluid motion, but it was a movement. The panel yielded, redistributed the force, and allowed the ice to pass without structural failure. A flicker of triumph, small but profound, ignited within him. He had found a way to work with the ice, not against it. However, the scale of his success was tiny compared to the immense problem facing Camp Century. This small test, though validating his core concept, was far from a full-scale solution. He needed more materials, more time, and a way to implement his system in a critical section of the base without drawing attention. The stakes were rising. Another more severe collapse had recently occurred near the main access tunnel, causing significant disruption to supply lines and prompting frantic, but ultimately conventional, repair efforts. The engineers were discussing further, even more drastic, reinforcement measures that Elias knew would only be temporary at best. The thought of revealing his work, of presenting his humble, scavenged solution to the highly educated engineers and rigid military command filled him with apprehension. He imagined the skepticism, the dismissive smiles. His rank, his lack of formal engineering training, would be insurmountable barriers. Yet the image of the men, tired and fearful, spurred him on. He had to find a way. He knew his solution, if proven at a larger scale, could make a critical difference. The question was not if it would work, but how he could make it happen before the ice claimed another life, or the entire dream of Camp Century. He began to plan his next, more audacious step, knowing that discovery was almost inevitable and the consequences severe. The escalating groans of the ice became a constant, unsettling chorus throughout Camp Century. Another section, a key artery leading to the science labs, showed alarming signs of imminent failure. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, releasing fine ice dust that settled like snow. Engineers, their faces etched with fatigue, ordered the installation of massive steel I-beams, a brute force approach that Elias Vance watched with a familiar sense of dread. He saw the futility, the rigid steel offering new points of resistance for the ice to simply push against elsewhere. The official channels were trapped in a cycle of reacting, not truly solving. Elias knew his small-scale success in the hidden cavity was not enough. The base was dying a slow, crushing death, and time was a luxury they no longer possessed. The image of the men, their faces grim and worried, the quiet despair in their eyes, fueled his resolve. He couldn't wait for permission, for bureaucracy to deliberate on an unproven concept from a non-commissioned officer. The weight of responsibility, the silent promise he felt he'd made to the men, pressed down on him with a force almost as tangible as the ice itself. He had to act. His plan was audacious, bordering on insubordination. He would implement a larger section of his adaptive panel system in one of the most critical and visibly failing tunnels, the main access route to the reactor chamber. This tunnel was not only vital for power and heat, but its collapse would isolate a significant portion of the base, jeopardizing lives and the entire mission. It was a high-stakes gamble, but the only one he saw. The first challenge was material. His small test pieces were inadequate for the scale required. He needed more of the heavy-duty reinforced rubber, more flexible steel cables, and larger sections of metal for the structural framework. Scavenging became a nocturnal art. He learned the patrol routes, the shift changes, the blind spots of the base. He moved like a shadow, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his senses heightened. One night he found old sections of a disused conveyor belt, thicker and wider than anything he'd used before, piled in a remote storage area. It was heavy, cumbersome, and moving it without detection was a monumental task. He spent hours under the cover of darkness, painstakingly cutting the material into manageable sections with a heavy-duty utility knife he'd sharpened to a razor's edge. Each cut was a silent prayer, each haul of the heavy rubber a testament to his determination. He made multiple trips, his muscles aching, his body shivering despite the exertion, until he had enough. Next, he needed a way to securely fasten these panels. He required specialized bolts, strong enough to resist the ice's pressure, yet allowing for some flexibility. He knew such bolts existed in the main engineering stores, meticulously cataloged and guarded. This was a direct risk. He spent days observing the inventory procedures, the times the storeroom was unmanned, the blind spots of the surveillance cameras. Simple, rotating lenses that offered predictable gaps in their coverage. The night he chose for this infiltration was bitterly cold, even by Camp Century standards. The wind howled above, a mournful dirge, muffling any sounds he might make. He slipped into the dimly lit storeroom, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air was thick with the smell of grease and metal. He moved with practiced stealth, locating the specific bins of specialized high-tensile bolts. He took only what he needed, a precise count, leaving no obvious signs of disturbance. The few minutes he spent in that storeroom felt like an eternity. Every creak of the ice, every distant hum of machinery, seeming to announce his presence. He emerged, the heavy bolts clinking softly in his canvas bag, a cold sweat dampening his brow, but exhilaration coursing through him. He had crossed a line, but for a purpose he believed in. He chose the critical section of the reactor access tunnel. It was a narrow passage, already showing significant deformation. The engineers had marked it for yet another, more robust, rigid reinforcement. Elias knew he had to act before they did. He began his work in secret, often during the long, early morning hours when most of the base was asleep, or during the brief periods when maintenance crews were diverted to other, more pressing but ultimately temporary repairs. His work was methodical, painstaking. First, he carefully removed the existing failing ice walls in the chosen section, carving out a wider recess than usual. He used a specialized ice saw, its motor a low rhythmic growl that he tried to mask with the general background hum of the base. He then began installing his modular panels. He fashioned a skeletal framework of salvaged steel, creating a floating cavity for each rubber section. The rubber panels, cut and shaped with precision, were then carefully fitted into place, their backs liberally coated with the heavy, waxy lubricant. He used his scavenged bolts, tightening them just enough to secure the panels, but allowing for the crucial degree of movement. Each bolt, each panel, was a testament to his singular vision. The physical toll was immense. His hands, constantly exposed to the cold, were raw and cracked. His muscles ached with an unending weariness. He slept in short, fitful bursts, often in the hidden cavity where he'd first tested his prototype, close to his work. The fear of discovery was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. He imagined the court-martial, the disgrace, the failure. But then he would remember the faces of the men, the precariousness of their existence, and the fear would transform into a fierce determination. One afternoon, as he was meticulously securing a particularly stubborn panel, he heard footsteps approaching. He froze, his tools clattering softly against the ice. He quickly doused his portable lamp, plunging the section into near darkness. He pressed himself against the cold, rough ice wall. His breath held. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped just outside his hidden section. "Sergeant Vance?" a voice called out. It was Lieutenant Miller, a junior engineer, sharp-eyed and by the book. Elias had seen him during briefings, a man who believed implicitly in the established protocols. "Are you in here, Sergeant? I thought I saw your lamp." Elias's mind raced. He could pretend to be inspecting something, but the scope of his unauthorized work was too vast to hide easily. He took a deep breath. "Yes, Lieutenant. Just checking some old stress fractures I noticed yesterday. Thought I heard something." His voice was steady, betraying none of the frantic energy coursing through him. Miller took a few more steps, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It swept past Elias, then slowly back, lingering for a moment on the slightly disturbed ice and the faint outlines of his tools. Elias tensed, ready for the confrontation. "Right," Miller said, his gaze fixed on a spot near Elias's feet. "Well, be careful, Sergeant. This section is due for major reinforcement next week. Orders from Captain Thorne." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "What exactly were you looking at, Sergeant?" Elias pointed vaguely at a hairline crack above his head. "Just a new fissure, sir. Looks like the pressure's shifting again." He spoke with the authority of someone who spent his days intimately acquainted with the ice's movements. Miller hesitated, then nodded. "Understood. Report anything significant, Sergeant, and try not to disturb the area too much before the crew gets in here." He gave Elias one last scrutinizing look before turning and walking away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Elias let out a slow, shaky breath. He had been close. Too close. Miller's suspicion, though unvoiced, was palpable. It meant he had to work faster, more carefully, and perhaps find a way to make his solution operational before the official reinforcement crew arrived. The incident only reinforced the precariousness of his position and the urgency of his mission. He redoubled his efforts. The thought of Miller's return, or the arrival of the official crew, drove him. He began to work almost continuously, snatching sleep only when his body threatened to give out. The panels, one by one, took shape in the critical tunnel. He envisioned the reactor tunnel as a living artery, now protected by a flexible, adaptive skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he completed a substantial section, perhaps 10 meters long, of his adaptive panel system. It was crude, imperfect, but it was there, installed in the very heart of the failing tunnel. He had worked around the existing structural weaknesses, using his panels to create a buffer zone, a yielding membrane between the relentless ice and the vulnerable inner structure. He had even devised a rudimentary monitoring system, using thin wires connected to simple pressure gauges he had scavenged to observe the panel's performance. Now came the real test. The ice, an indifferent and patient adversary, would soon begin to press against his work. He retreated to a small vantage point nearby, his heart a drum against his ribs. He watched and he waited. The silence of the base, broken only by the distant hum of the reactor and the omnipresent creaking of the ice, seemed to amplify the tension. He knew that the fate of Camp Century and the lives of its men might hinge on the success or failure of his desperate, unsanctioned gamble. The ice, a slow-motion force, was already beginning its inexorable push against his carefully constructed panels. The gauges, scavenged and recalibrated, began to show subtle, yet discernible, readings. This was it. The ice, a slow-motion force, was already beginning its inexorable push against his carefully constructed panels. The gauges, scavenged and recalibrated, began to show subtle, yet discernible readings. This was it. Elias, hidden in his small vantage point, watched with a mixture of dread and fervent hope. The air in the tunnel grew colder, carrying with it the deep, resonant groans of the glacial mass. It was a sound he knew intimately, a symphony of immense, patient power. He could feel the vibrations through the very ice he leaned against, a low thrum that spoke of geological shifts. He kept his gaze fixed on the pressure gauges he had wired to the panels. The needles, once resting at zero, now quivered, inching steadily upwards. He noted the specific points where the pressure was most intense, correlating them with his observations of the ice's natural flow. The rubber panels, coated with the thick, waxy lubricant, were performing as he had hoped. Instead of resisting rigidly, they were subtly deforming, absorbing the lateral force. He saw the ice in its slow, deliberate creep begin to slide along the lubricated surface, past the edges of the panels, rather than crushing them head-on. It was not a violent struggle, but a yielding, a redirection of force. A profound sense of relief, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. It was working. But the triumph was fleeting. The overall condition of Camp Century continued to deteriorate. News filtered through the base of more severe structural compromises in other tunnels. A large, non-critical storage cavern experienced a partial collapse, trapping equipment and forcing a desperate, hours-long effort to clear debris. The incident, though without casualties, further frayed nerves and intensified the calls for immediate, drastic action from command. The engineers, under immense pressure, began to prepare for the installation of even larger, more intrusive steel supports in the reactor access tunnel, precisely the section Elias had covertly fortified. The timeline for their arrival was now imminent, perhaps only a day or two away. Elias knew his window was closing. His small 10-meter section was a testament to his theory, but it was just a patch. The rest of the tunnel remained vulnerable. He wrestled with the dilemma: reveal his work and risk court-martial for insubordination, or allow the official, potentially disastrous reinforcement to proceed, possibly destroying his innovation in the process. The alternative was to work even faster, to extend his system, but he lacked the time and the materials. and the constant threat of discovery loomed larger than ever. He spent another night in the tunnel, fueled by cold coffee and a desperate urgency. He heard the distant sounds of heavy machinery being moved, the preparations for the official reinforcement. He knew they were coming for his section. He needed to make a final, undeniable demonstration of his panel's effectiveness, something that would speak for itself. He focused his efforts on fine-tuning the existing section, making sure every bolt was optimally tightened, every panel perfectly aligned. The next morning, as the base stirred to life, Elias was still in the reactor access tunnel, observing his panels. The pressure gauges showed a steady, sustained load, greater than any he had simulated in his tests. Yet, the panels held. The ice continued its slow, grinding movement, but it was being redirected, its destructive force dissipated. Suddenly, he heard the distinctive crunch of heavy boots on ice heading directly towards his section. This wasn't a patrol. This was a team. He quickly doused his lamp and pressed himself against a shadowed recess, his heart hammering. He recognized the voices. Lieutenant Miller, Captain Thorne, and a lead engineer, Dr. Aris. They were the advance party for the reinforcement crew. "This is the section, Captain," Miller's voice echoed. "Dr. Aris believes the stress here is particularly acute due to the intersection with the geothermal pipes. We're looking at installing 4 new I-beams, running parallel to the existing structure, with additional cross-bracing." "A heavy solution, Lieutenant," Captain Thorne replied, his voice grave, "but necessary. We cannot risk a breach here. The reactor is paramount." Dr. Aris, a man known for his meticulous, if sometimes rigid adherence to engineering principles, chimed in. "Indeed, Captain. Our models indicate this is the optimum approach. The ice will simply have to yield to superior structural integrity." There was a faint note of frustration in his voice, a weariness from the constant battle. As they approached Elias's section, their flashlights swept across the tunnel walls. Elias held his breath, willing himself to be invisible. The beams danced over his panels, lingering for a moment. He saw Miller squint, then lean closer, his brow furrowed. "Lieutenant?" Captain Thorne prompted. "Captain," Miller said slowly, his voice laced with confusion. "It appears some work has already been done here." He pointed his flashlight directly at Elias's panels. "These aren't our standard reinforcements. These are panels, and they're not on the schematics." Dr. Aris stepped forward, his expression shifting from professional assessment to outright disbelief. He ran a gloved hand over one of Elias's rubber panels, then pressed against it. He felt the subtle give, the slight deformation. He saw the faint, waxy sheen on the ice behind it. "What in blazes is this?" The question was sharp, accusatory. "This is completely unauthorized and highly irregular. Who installed this?" Captain Thorne's voice hardened. "Lieutenant Miller, do you have any idea about this? Sergeant Vance was observed in this area yesterday, was he not?" Miller turned, his eyes searching the shadows. "He was, Captain, but he claimed he was merely inspecting stress fractures. I had a feeling." His voice trailed off. Elias knew this was it. He had to step forward. He pushed away from the ice wall, emerging from the shadows. "Captain Thorne, Dr. Aris, Lieutenant Miller, I am responsible for this." His voice, though quiet, was firm, carrying a surprising authority. A collective gasp, then stunned silence. Dr. Aris gawked, his mouth slightly open. Captain Thorne's face was a mask of stern disapproval, his eyes narrowing to slits. Miller looked from Elias to the panels, a dawning comprehension mixed with exasperation on his face. "Sergeant Vance!" Captain Thorne's voice boomed, echoing off the ice. "Do you have any idea of the gravity of your actions? Unauthorized modifications to critical infrastructure. This is a court-martial offense, Sergeant." "With all due respect, Captain," Elias began, his voice unwavering, "I believe these modifications are what saved this section from collapse." He gestured towards the panels. "Look, sir, the ice has been pushing here for hours. See the pressure gauges? They're showing significant load. Yet the tunnel is holding. There are no new cracks, no visible deformation of the inner walls. Dr. Aris scoffed. "Nonsense, Sergeant! A few rubber panels and some scavenged parts. Our models unequivocally state that this section requires rigid steel supports to counteract the immense lateral forces." He tried to push a panel back, but it yielded only slightly. "Sir, the rigid supports are precisely the problem," Elias countered, his tone respectful but resolute. "They fight the ice head-on. My system, adaptive resilience as I call it, works with the ice. It allows it to flow, to redistribute its pressure, rather than building up immense stress points." He pointed to the faint, almost invisible tracks of ice flow on the lubricated surfaces behind the panels. "The ice is moving past, not crushing. It's working." Captain Thorne, though clearly furious, possessed a pragmatist's mind. He looked from Elias to the panels, then to Dr. Aris, whose face was a mixture of outrage and intellectual curiosity. The captain then turned his gaze to the surrounding ice walls, which, unlike other parts of the base, showed no new signs of imminent failure in this particular section. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the deep, resonant groans of the glacial mass from deeper within the base, a reminder of the constant threat. "Dr. Aris," Thorne said, his voice now lower, more controlled. "Your assessment?" Aris, momentarily losing his composure, stammered, "Captain, this is unconventional, highly unorthodox. It flies in the face of established engineering principles for ice structures. However," he paused, examining the gauges, then the panels again. He pressed his ear against the ice near the panel. "The readings are stable, and the ice does appear to be moving around it, not directly against it. I cannot deny the visual evidence of the tunnel's stability here compared to the adjacent sections." He looked at Elias with a new grudging respect, mixed with professional pique. "But it's impossible. It shouldn't work." "But it does, sir," Elias stated simply, his gaze steady. "I've been observing it for days. I've seen the pressure build and I've seen the ice yield." Captain Thorne looked at the men, then back at Elias. The official reinforcement crew was waiting. They had a schedule, a mission, but he also had a failing base, and a sergeant who claimed to have found a solution. The entire purpose of Camp Century, the strategic implications, hinged on its stability. He had to make a decision, and quickly. The cold truth was, their conventional methods were failing. "Dr. Aris," Thorne said, his voice firm, "postpone the immediate reinforcement of this specific section. I want a full, immediate assessment of Sergeant Vance's system. A comprehensive analysis. Compare its performance against our conventional methods in adjacent, equally stressed areas. I want data, not conjecture. Lieutenant Miller ensures Sergeant Vance provides all necessary information and cooperates fully with Dr. Aris's team. And Sergeant Vance, you are confined to quarters until further notice, pending this investigation, but your system remains in place for now." Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of relief and trepidation. Confinement. Investigation. It was far from a triumph, but it was not outright dismissal. His work, his desperate gamble, would be examined. It had a chance. He had bought the base and its men a little more time. As he was led away by two junior officers, he cast one last glance at his panels, silently willing them to hold, to continue proving their worth against the relentless, patient might of the Greenland ice. The real test, he knew, was just beginning. The bureaucratic resistance, though momentarily bypassed, would be a formidable force, almost as unyielding as the ice itself. His ingenuity had bought a reprieve, but the struggle for true acceptance and widespread implementation was far from over. The future of Camp Century, and perhaps his own, hung in a delicate balance, suspended between the slow creep of the ice and the cautious turn of the official gaze. The confinement of Sergeant Elias Vance was, in practice, a peculiar form of observation. He remained in his quarters, a small Spartan room, But the scientific team, led by Dr. Aris and closely supervised by Lieutenant Miller, was now engaged in an intensive study of his adaptive resilience system. The very tunnel Elias had fortified became a laboratory. Sensors were attached, laser measurements taken, and detailed logs recorded. Dr. Aris, initially dismissive, approached the task with a scientist's rigor, determined to either validate or thoroughly debunk the sergeant's audacious claim. Days turned into a tense vigil. From his room, Elias could hear the distant, rhythmic hum of the reactor, the subtle creaks and groans of the ice, and the occasional shouts of the assessment team. Lieutenant Miller, now a frequent visitor to the reactor access tunnel, found himself increasingly drawn into the intricate details of Elias's design. He observed the pressure gauges, compared them to the stress readings from conventionally reinforced sections, and began to see the subtle yet undeniable difference. Where rigid steel supports elsewhere showed increasing strain, the adaptive panels in Elias's section continued to yield and redirect. The data began to speak for itself, slowly eroding Dr. Aris's initial skepticism. His complex models, designed for static forces, struggled to account for the dynamic, almost organic way Elias's system interacted with the ice. He saw the ice flow marks on the lubricated rubber, the minute-controlled deformations that absorbed immense pressure without structural compromise. He still grumbled about the unorthodox materials and the lack of proper engineering documentation, but his tone shifted from outright rejection to a grudging, then fascinated curiosity. He started to ask Miller detailed questions about Elias's methods, his scavenging, his design rationale. Miller, in turn, found himself explaining the practical, almost intuitive, logic behind Elias's choices. Meanwhile, the overall structural integrity of Camp Century continued to be a grave concern. A particularly severe cold snap brought with it increased ice movement. Another major support tunnel, far from Elias's section and fortified with the latest conventional methods, suffered a significant buckling. The sounds of cracking ice and groaning steel echoed through the base, a stark reminder of the constant peril. Repair crews worked ceaselessly, their efforts often feeling like a losing battle. Morale plummeted further. The men walked with a new tension, every creak a potential harbinger of disaster. The official solutions were clearly struggling to cope. Captain Thorne, a man of action and results, observed the escalating crisis with growing apprehension. He reviewed Dr. Aris's preliminary reports, which, despite their cautious language, highlighted the remarkable stability of the reactor access tunnel's fortified section. The contrast with the ongoing failures elsewhere was stark. He saw the men's faces, etched with fear, and the tireless, yet increasingly futile, efforts of the engineering teams. The strategic mission of Camp Century, the very rationale for its existence, was being undermined by its inherent instability. One evening, Captain Thorne summoned Dr. Aris and Lieutenant Miller to his office. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken tension. "Gentlemen," Thorne began, his gaze piercing, "the situation is critical. We are losing the fight against the ice. Dr. Aris, your preliminary findings on Sergeant Vance's system are intriguing. Miller, you've been monitoring its performance firsthand. What is your assessment without the usual scientific caveats?" Miller, taking a deep breath, spoke with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Captain, the system is holding. It's not just holding, it's adapting. Where our rigid reinforcements are being crushed, Sergeant Vance's panels are yielding, redirecting the pressure. I've seen it with my own eyes. The data supports it. It's different, but it works." Dr. Aris, after a moment of internal struggle, nodded slowly. "Captain, my models still cannot fully explain the mechanics of this adaptive resilience in a purely theoretical framework. It defies some established principles. However, the empirical evidence is undeniable. The section fortified by Sergeant Vance is experiencing the same, if not greater, lateral ice pressure as other failing sections. Yet it remains stable. The ice is flowing around it. It is, for all intents and purposes, a functional solution to a problem we have been unable to solve with conventional means. He paused, then added, "It is an ingenious, if entirely unsanctioned, approach." Thorne leaned back, his gaze fixed on a map of the base, riddled with red markers indicating stress fractures and collapse points. The reactor tunnel section, now green on the map, stood out like a beacon. "Ingenious indeed," he murmured, "and we are running out of time for sanctioned solutions." He looked at Eris and Miller. "This base cannot fail. Our mission cannot fail. Gentlemen, we need to adapt, and if Sergeant Vance has found a way to adapt to this environment, then we will use it." The following morning, Elias was released from confinement. There was no formal apology, no ceremony. Instead, he was met by Lieutenant Miller, who simply handed him a set of schematics and a work order. "Sergeant Vance," Miller said, a flicker of respect in his eyes, "Captain Thorne has authorized a full-scale implementation of your adaptive resilience system in the main access tunnels. Dr. Eris's team will be assisting you, under your direct supervision for the practical installation. You are to prioritize the most critical sections immediately." Elias felt a quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of purpose. He did not seek a medal or a promotion. His only desire was to ensure the safety of the men and the viability of the base. He looked at the schematics, then at Miller. "We'll need more material, Lieutenant, and a dedicated crew. This won't be easy." Miller nodded. "Resources have been reallocated. Dr. Eris is already redesigning supply chains to accommodate your material specifications. And you'll have a team, Sergeant. The captain has made it clear. Your methods are now the priority." The transformation of Camp Century began. Elias, no longer working in secret, moved through the tunnels with a new authority, a quiet confidence born of validated experience. He directed teams of engineers and laborers, teaching them the nuances of adaptive resilience, how to carve the ice, how to lubricate the panels, how to allow the glacial mass to flow rather than resist. Dr. Eris, initially a supervisor, became an eager student, fascinated by the practical application of principles he was only beginning to grasp. Lieutenant Miller became Elias's most reliable liaison, bridging the gap between the practical realities of the ice and the demands of command. The work was immense, arduous, but now infused with a new sense of hope. Discarded conveyor belts, old fuel drums, and flexible cables were no longer scavenged. They were acquired, processed, and installed with a dedicated purpose. The men witnessing the tangible progress, the visible stability returning to sections that had been on the verge of collapse, found their morale slowly, steadily improving. The omnipresent fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. The true climax arrived several months later, a particularly violent series of seismic tremors triggered by distant geological shifts sent shockwaves through the Greenland ice sheet. Camp Century groaned and shuddered like a living entity. Alarms blared. Men braced themselves for the inevitable collapses. In the command center, Captain Thorne and his officers watched the monitoring screens with bated breath. Throughout the base, the conventionally reinforced tunnels, despite their massive steel I-beams, showed alarming signs of distress. Cracks splintered, ice dust rained down, and the ominous sounds of snapping metal could be heard. But in the sections where Elias's adaptive panels had been installed, the story was different. The pressure gauges surged, reaching unprecedented levels, yet the panels held. They buckled, vibrated, and deformed, absorbing the immense kinetic energy of the rumbling ice, allowing it to flow and dissipate around the vital infrastructure. The tunnels, though shaken, remained structurally sound. When the tremors finally subsided, an eerie silence settled over Camp Century, broken only by the relief of hushed voices. Damage reports flooded in, detailing collapses in several non-critical, conventionally reinforced areas. But the main access tunnels, the reactor chamber, and other crucial arteries protected by Elias's system had weathered the storm. They were intact. Captain Thorne walked through the reactor access tunnel, now a testament to Elias's ingenuity. He ran his hand over a rubber panel, feeling the slight give, the subtle curve that had absorbed the ice's fury. He saw Dr. Eris, his face streaked with grime but alight with a profound understanding, taking measurements. He saw Lieutenant Miller, exhaustion etched on his face, but a quiet triumph in his eyes. And then he saw Sergeant Vance, not seeking praise but simply inspecting his panels, making notes, already thinking of refinements. Elias Vance never received a medal for his innovation. He remained a sergeant, diligently performing his duties. His name was not emblazoned on any official plaque. The reports filed about Camp Century's stabilization spoke of advanced engineering solutions and adaptive structural modifications, the true genesis of which was often obscured by bureaucratic language. Yet his impact was undeniable. Camp Century, once teetering on the brink of collapse, found a new lease on life. It continued its scientific research, its strategic purpose, sustained by the quiet ingenuity of an anonymous hero. The men who lived and worked within its icy walls knew the truth. They walked through the stable tunnels, past the flexible panels, and they understood the silent courage that had saved them. Elias Vance, the non-commissioned officer who saw the ice not as an enemy to be fought, but as a force to be understood and worked with, had ensured their survival. His legacy was the quiet hum of a stabilized base, the continued breath of hundreds of men, and the enduring testament to the power of human observation, persistence, and practical brilliance in the face of overwhelming odds. The strategic whispers of the Arctic base faded, replaced by the enduring testament to human resilience forged in the heart of the frozen continent.